Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Future Ed IELTS online lessons. We are the official British Council test centre, and welcome to our foundation course this evening. Tonight we're looking at writing task 1 for academic writing, and this is lesson 6. Tonight we're going to look at how to find important points to report and how to write a good introduction. So first of all, let's just do a little revision. We're going to look for the main points in our graph because we're given a lot of data. And what we first want to do is we want to just remind ourselves to ask the right question. So ask the right question, and that helps you to get the right answers. So this is once again revision, those 5 questions. What's the topic? What's the tense? What are the units? And what are the main points? And tonight we're going to look at everything in blue. What are the main points? What stands out? What can we contrast? What's the highest? What's the lowest? And then once again, what can we group? What's more than? What's less than? What's similar? And anything interesting that we can just close with. So let's just have a look at what we need to know. Very often we can get a table or a bar graph, and these have a lot of information in them. And of course, we do not have to write about all the information. We really want to pull out the main points. So they can look confusing, but we do not have to write about everything. Our key skills, we need to be selective. Choose carefully what information is important and group information where you can. Look for what's similar and group that. Know what questions to ask yourself so you can get the right answers. And of course, you're going to use your language to compare and contrast. And remember to vary your grammar structures and vary your vocabulary. And your technique, once again, ask the 5 questions to find the important information. So let's have a look at task 1. Tonight, you're going to do some work, and what I've got is I've got a number of graphs, and I want you to pull out the main points. So let's read the instruction together. Look at the following graphs one by one and extract the most important information. And then we'll have a look at some answers. So the first one I've done for you, and here we're looking at a main graph, at a bar graph. So what I want you to do is I want you to have a look at this graph, read the instruction, and I want you to decide what you think the main points are, what you think stands out, what you find you can contrast, and what information you can group together. So I'm going to give you a few minutes just to examine the graph and make some notes. If you need to make a screenshot, the worksheet will be available after the lesson, I'm told. If you need to make a screenshot and just make some notes on a pad, and you're going to be filling in the information that's in blue on the on the right hand side. I'll give you one more minute. Hi, Arif. You've just joined us. Are you clear on the task, Arif? Okay, so let's have a look. Let's move to the next slide. And once again, just check the main points. Did you get something like this? So, for example, for the overview, we could definitely state that men had more leisure time than women did in general. And then we want to contrast the lowest and the highest. So we could say the most important information would be, if we have a look at what's happening over here, our unemployed and our retired men and women. Whoa. Obviously, those points are the highest. And then we can mention, while on the other hand, to contrast it, we can have a look and we can see that both men and women employed full-time had the least amount of leisure. And then we could have a look at what was more or less similar, and we could combine the unemployed and retired, saying that they had exactly the same amount of leisure time. I've kept it simple. So if we notice what's different, but we could compare the difference between people employed full-time and those people who are retired. And we could say that they have half as much time as those people who are retired. And then we could say that in general, the men had more leisure time than the women, and particularly for those working full-time, the men had twice as much leisure time as women. And an interesting point, we could say that only women were employed part-time, so there were no men, and only women were housewives. And we could say then again that those employed part-time have half as much time as the housewives. So let's move on to the next slide. So now I've prepared another two graphs. One is a line graph and one is a table. And what I want you to do is read through the instruction and once again choose the main points. And I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes to do that. Good. How did you go with that one, Arif? Hello, welcome. Izupu. Good. And let's have a look at the next one. Oops. And now we're having a look at a table, and once again, just have a look at the instruction, and once again, practice pulling out the main points. This time, you can imagine them for yourself. Can you hear me okay this evening? I'm sorry, I've got a little bit of a cold. Do you need more time? Okay, so let's move on a little bit forward. We're building on previous lessons, so I hope you managed to get online for our previous lessons. Our task 1, we looked at line graphs. We looked at how to talk about change over time with language of movement. And then we looked at how to compare information and language to compare and contrast. And then we moved on and we started looking at bar graphs. We have definitely, we're now really moving into comparing and contrasting this information. So this evening's lesson builds on that. And what we're actually doing is we're putting what we've learned in the previous lessons into practice. So one of the things that's really important is to be able to just identify the main points in the graph. We don't have to repeat, we don't have to write about everything. I'm just repeating a little for those who've come online since the beginning of the lesson. So we don't need to write about everything, and those questions that I gave you, those are the questions we need to ask ourselves. What's important? What's the overview? What stands out here? And a little table, this is the first time we've seen a table. We've got a lot of data, a lot of figures. But what we want to do is we want to go and have a look at our bottom lines, because that's really our main information, isn't it? Our main overview information is going to be found in my totals. So I've got a total over here, and even more importantly, I've got a large total over here. So in terms of my overview points, what did you decide? I'll just flick to the next slide, and we can have a look at some of those together. Oh, I've got that one. Okay, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just I'll Oh, yes, I tell you what I've done. I've looked at the first one we've done and moved back to the second one. So once you've completed the graph on tables, I'll just move forward. And now we'll have a look at my points and see if you had something similar. So your planning should look something like this. You don't need to write a lot of words. You don't need to write full sentences. When you get your graph, you're going to take 3, maybe 5 minutes at the most to ask those questions and to make some notes on the main points. So I think the main overview, and perhaps I would change that even slightly more now, is that definitely there were a lot more people buying takeaways 20 years later or buying fast food than there were in the 1970s. So a much larger number are actually purchasing takeaway food. Another kind of overview point would be that for our fish and chips, we noticed that they were the most popular, and then 20 years later, they were the most popular at this point over here, and 20 years later, they actually ended up the least popular. So that gives me a chance to talk nicely about that sort of language. So, so we're looking at the highest fish and chips was consumed, and we're using the passive. The fish and chips was consumed the most, followed by hamburgers. So we're having a look at the beginning. Fish and chips was the most popular or consumed the most, followed by the hamburgers, and the least favorite was pizza in 1970. And then we could group both the hamburger and the pizza because we've got a similar upward trend here. Although the one goes up more than the other, we could still describe a similar trend. So we could say that both hamburgers and pizza, the amount consumed increased from to, and we're going to use that little word respectively. So we would mention our figures at the beginning and our figures at the end, to respectively. While, and here we're looking at our contrasting word, which joins two sentences and also gives me a more complex structure. So we are looking to include some complex structures in our writing. Shortly after 1980, we could say the demand for hamburgers overtook that of fish and chips. So that's another point that we do want to mention, particularly on a line graph, when at this point here, we can see that the popularity or the amount consumed of one product actually overtakes the amount. And in this particular graph, we get that a second time when at this point over here, just shortly after 1995, more people began to consume more pizza than fish and chips. So at this point, we've had a complete reversal of the situation. So did you get some similar main points to that? Do you have any questions? Okay, let's have a look at the main ideas for the table. And that's what we're looking at tonight, is we're looking at pulling out main ideas. What are we going to write about? So once again, we'll just have a look at this table and let's have a look. They need to be on the same page, don't they, without a worksheet that will be uploaded after the lesson. So you will be able to download that. So let's have a look. If we have a look at this table here, we notice that we've got two big divisions here. First of all, we've got our non-book club members and we've got our book club members. So two different categories there. And then our book club members are divided into three further categories. So we could say they were subdivided into three further categories. So what would our main ideas be here? Certainly we're looking at our total figure. 3,024 units were sold in the month of February. And we could say that magazines made up just over half of total sales, followed by non-fiction, with fiction being the least popular. So first of all, we would talk about our big tables, our big totals. Then we could run our eye along the bottom here, and remembering that we've got a little bit of a division here between our book club members and our non-book club members, we could start comparing those figures. We could see that students were the best customers, given that, of course, it was a college bookstore, and that college students purchased just under half the amount of books that they just purchased just under half the amount of books than everybody else. We could state maybe that the book club members purchased a third of the books from the bookstores, so they were good customers too, weren't they? And then we could go into the figures. We could look a little further into the figures, and we could decide what else we wanted to write about. Is anything similar? Do we notice anything similar? Does anything fluctuate more? So we could say, for example, that most of the college students purchased magazines. That's the highest number there. While most of the book club members purchased the non-fiction. What else could we mention there? We could say it's interesting to note that the members of the public had no interest in fiction at all. Given that it's a college bookshop, I guess members of the public would not be shopping there for fiction. They would. And then we could break that further down in each category, saying, for example, that non-fiction was the most popular with members of the public, while magazines were the most popular with the college staff. So there we've got a point similar that we could mention. That for both, for magazines, both college students as well as college staff, magazines were the most popular purchase. While for members of the public, magazines were the least popular purchase. And we could include that. We could say members of the public as well as book club members, magazines were the least popular purchase. So that's just some brief practice at looking and practicing pulling out the main points in the graph. And now let's have a look at those introductions. So how to write a good introduction for our graphs and our tables. As we've seen from the graphs, we are given information. And what we want to do is we just want to paraphrase the information given. So that means that we're going to rewrite the information in our own words, but make sure we want to keep the same meaning. We do not need to rephrase or paraphrase every single word. And we can use synonyms to vary our vocabulary, or we could use different parts of speech. So we could change the structure of the sentence and we could use different parts of speech. We could also vary our sentence structure. We could change from active to passive voice, or we could even include a gerund or a relative clause. And if you're looking to get a 7, then these are the sort of grammar structures that you do want to include in your writing. So let's do task number 4. We're going to go back to the initial graph, which was the graph showing the amount of leisure time enjoyed by men and women. And we want to actually have a look at writing an introduction for this one. So thinking about how you would paraphrase the graph. Did you manage to take a screenshot of it, or do you need me to reverse back because you don't have the worksheet tonight? Do you need me to go back to the graph about the men and women? You can just type in the chat box. I'll just skip back to it so you can make a screenshot anyway. And there we go. And I've drawn all over it. So if you can just take a screenshot of that. Have you got that? Okay, and then I'll just flick forward to those notes. And now we're going to think about paraphrasing the given task. So this is the task that I was given, and we're going to rephrase that. So I've done a little table below here, and what I want you to do is I want you to look at each part of it and think about how you could actually change that. So if you can make a screenshot of that, just draw yourself a little table on your notepad, and I'll give you a minute to paraphrase your introduction. And let's have a look at the next slide. Now, of course, there are many different ways that you could write this, and many of them would be correct, but I'll show you what I thought of when I looked at that task. So have a look step by step. They give us the chart below, and I've changed that into the given bar graph. If I use that word given, that indicates I'm using this passive, which kind of becomes my adjective, the given bar graph. And then shows. Again, there are many ways that you could say this. You could show shows. You could say the given bar graph compares and contrasts. And then we're being very specific. We're being very clear in what we're going to do with this information. We're going to compare and contrast. Now, this little word, how much, is very useful because, of course, we're talking about quantity in these graphs. And so how much is a useful way to talk about the amount or the number. So my sentence so far is going to read, the given bar graph compares and contrasts how much free time. So notice how I've changed that. Leisure time becomes free time. So I've used a slightly different word. I've used a synonym. And there, free time was available. So notice how I've changed that phrase. Then they give us men and women, and I changed that to males and females. So I can show the examiner that I have varied it with, and I've used my countable for my genders. Now have a look at this little word, who were, okay? And here I've put in a relative pronoun. So it's going to actually, this is the sort of grammar you're looking to include if you're wanting to get that 6.5 or that 7. So I've got, let's read it through from there. The given bar graph compares and contrasts how much free time was available to males and females who were in different types of employment, or I could say in different kinds of employment. So those little words, types and kind, are quite useful to be able to vary my language in my introduction. Now, because I've got quite a lot, I could actually then have 2 sentences for my introduction, and I could say the survey was conducted. And once again, I'm looking at my content, my form. And this is a useful word too. The survey was conducted is another way to vary the way we write an introduction. And then, of course, our time in 2000, and I could add in the year 2000. And I'm showing the examiner that I'm talking about in the year, my preposition of time, in for period of time, in the year, this specific year. So I'm also using my definite article accurately, in the specific year 2000. So let's read that introduction through. I'll just give you a chance to read it through on your own. We'll just read this task over here. Now let's just very quickly have a look at our subject-verb agreement. The bar graph, it. So I need to say it compares and contrasts. If you want your 7, if you need to have a 7 for your writing, for your line graphs, you want to make sure that you're getting your your third person singular, your subject verb agreement correct. And then I'm also talking about males and females. In this instance, countable. We can count them 1 male, 2 males. So my countable who were in different. Now different is plural, isn't it? So I need to say different types because it's many types or different types. So I need to indicate, I need to keep my subject, my agreement between those 2 words. Good. So just read it through once again. The given bar graph compares and contrasts how much free time was available to males and females who were in different types of employment in the year 2000. And that's one way to write a good introduction. So now what I want you to do, we'll move onto the next slide. And what I want you to do is I want you to do the second one yourself. Yes. So, so now do the following to yourself. Hello, Guruvpreet. You've come in. You've come in. Good. Guruvpreet, do try to access this lesson online so that you can start right from the beginning. We've done 2 important things in our lesson tonight. Number 1, we've looked at how to find the main ideas, what to write about when they give us a lot of information. And now we're just having a look at how to write a good introduction. Do you need some more time? You can just let me know in the chat box. Do you need more time? Or shall we flick on to the next size? Okay, so let's flick onto the next side. Oh, and did you get something? Now remember, there are many different ways that we could write this, and so each of us would have written this bar graph, this introduction slightly differently. So if you want to type them in the chat box, or if you want to type them in and send them to Morshed, he can flick them onto me, and we can just have a look at yours. This is what I did. And of course, every time I write it, I would write it slightly differently. But let's let's see what I've done here. So once again, I've used the given bar graph. Actually, I think that was a line graph, wasn't it? So I've made a mistake there. That's actually a line graph. So the given line graph illustrates how fast food consumption patterns changed over a 20-year period. And I've used between 1970 and 1990. And for my table, they give us, the table below summarizes some data collected by the college workshop for the month of February 2010. And I've changed that to say the given table compares and contrasts sales figures for both fiction and non-fiction books, as well as magazines in a certain college bookstore. Have a look at this word certain. I'm going to come back and go through it one by full stop. So I'm writing two sentences again. The survey was conducted in 2010 and was divided into two main categories, namely book club members and non-book club members. So I'm just going to flick back to that table for Gaurapreet, so that you can take a screenshot of that, Gaurapreet. Did you get a screenshot of each one of these? So there's the table. You'd like to take a screenshot of that. Of course, when we're dealing with something like tables, we get a lot of different categories. So we can mention these, name them in the introduction. I'll just flick back for you, Gaurapreet, just to make sure that you got a screenshot of the line graph. And then I'll flick back and you can take a screenshot of that bar graph. So tonight we were looking at finding main points in each one of these and also writing an introduction for each one of these. Good. All right, I'll just flick forward and let's have a look at that last introduction. Good. So let's have a look at what I've done here. Once again, I've used the language, the given table, and I've used that compares and contrasts. And then I've used sales figures is a very useful word because we're very often talking about how much was sold, either in units or in dollars. For both fiction and non-fiction books, as well as magazines. So I've included that category, that type, and then have a look at this in. So I'm using my preposition correctly, and in a certain bookshop. So I'm using my indefinite article to talk about any bookshop. We don't know which one. And have a look at a certain bookshop. Just a useful little word you can pop in there. And then I move to my second sentence to describe the categories. The survey was conducted, once again, there's my passive, in 2010. And I'm linking my two sentences, and was divided into two main categories, namely book club members and non-book club members. So have a look at this language here, and was divided into two or sometimes three, whatever your graph, your table gives you, main categories. And that's one way that we can write an introduction for tables. We can actually name the categories. So I'm just going to flick forward now, and if you can take a screenshot of this, I've written you one model answer. You'd like to just take a screenshot of that and read through that. So let's just read through that quickly. The given bar graph illustrates, so there I've used another word, illustrates. The given bar graph illustrates how fast foods consumption patterns changed. So I've given you yet another way to actually write your introduction with how, rather than how much, how the pattern changed. So the given bar graph illustrates how fast food consumption patterns changed as measured in grams per week. The survey was conducted between 1970 and 1990 for 3 common takeaway foods, namely, this is a very useful word for naming your categories, namely fish and chips, hamburgers, and pizza. Then we're going to start writing about our overview or what stands out. And you could use either one of these, overall or in general. And we wouldn't necessarily mention figures in our overview, but it's what are the main trends, what stands out. So overall, the popularity of fish and chips declined. There I'm using my language of movement from my line graphs lesson 1. While, and there I'm using my linker, we started looking at how to link our ideas in lesson 3. The trend for both hamburgers and pizza, because remember we mentioned that they were a similar trend. Reflected is also a useful word, an increase over the 20-year period surveyed. All fast food consumption rose exponentially during this time. So once again, rose exponentially. I'm using my language to talk about change over time. So we could say initially in 1970, fish and chips was the most preferred takeaway by far. So very often we are able to use words like the most popular. Have a look at how I turned that around. The popularity of fish and chips. So this is what I meant by talking about the most popular, the least popular. See, I've used that structure down here, the least popular. I'm using that with my superlative, the least popular. And here I'm changing my part of speech. I'm taking my word popular, my adjective, and I am turning it into my abstract noun, the popularity of fish and chips. So if you want your 7, you're looking to show the examiner that you can actually change the part of speech. So initially, fish and chips was the most preferred. There's another word that we could use to talk about the choice, the most preferred, once again, using my most and my least. That's my language to talk about. We call them superlatives, the highest or the lowest, the most or the least. So have a look at this sentence. Initially, in 1970, fish and chips was the most preferred takeaway by far. That's useful if there's a big difference. At around 300 grams per week, the fish option, so look at how I've varied my vocabulary there. The fish option was 3 times more popular than. And here I'm using a comparative structure with my 3 times. So look for places in the graph that you're going to write about to talk about twice as much or 3 times as much. It gives you an opportunity to illustrate it. And this kind of paints a picture when you say 3 times more popular than. It makes, it gives good clarity. And there I'm using my more, my comparative structure, more than. So let's read that again. At around 300 grams per week, the fish option was 3 times more popular than a hamburger. And then these brackets are very useful, especially when I'm talking about a lot of information and I perhaps get a longer sentence at just under 100 grams per week. And notice how I've written that as GWP because I'm using that there. I don't have to write that out in full each time. Now we're going to look at the opposite. On the other hand, pizza was the least popular fast food in 1970, with only approximately 30 grams per week being consumed. However, and we're contrasting again, 20 years later, at the end of my survey, have a look at this figures for. This is a useful little word, this figures for. It gives me another way to be able to describe my data. Figures for fish and chips reflected, that's a useful word, reflected a 30% drop, which as we saw was our 3 times more, 30% drop, and fish became the least popular takeaway with only 200 grams consumed per week as opposed to 300 grams per week at the beginning of the survey. So have a look at that, as opposed to. In contrast, just after 1985, and have a look at that, just after 1985 or just below. Those are useful little words that give you better flow. The examiner is not going to be that kind to you and always give you exact figures. So in contrast, just after 1985, first, the amount of hamburger meat eaten overtook that of fish, and shortly afterwards, in 1985, I think that date might not be quite correct. We'll just go back and double check that. The amount, I think that might be 1980. I think that might be 1980. And shortly afterwards, in 1985, the amount of pizza consumed overtook that of fish. So this is another useful little word. when we get that crossover on our line graph. And then hamburgers remained twice as popular as pizzas in 1990. And very quickly, I end up with 203 words. You probably don't want to write much more than that. You could write, say, between 150, 160 to 180 would be good. But very quickly with a table, with more information, you can get that word count higher. So what you can do is take the other two graphs and practice writing. Practice writing a report for both the people, the bar graph and the table. I think that's all for tonight. Do you have any questions? Is there anything you need me to go back on? How was that? Did you learn something tonight? Sorry, I've got a bit of a cold tonight. How was that for you, Iopu? You learned something tonight? Hello, Esther. You've come in quite late. I didn't see you there. Did you manage to pick up something tonight? These lessons will be available online, so you should be able to access them after the class. And you should also be able to download the worksheet. And so you'll be able to go through the lesson again. This was lesson 6 of our line graphs. So we've spent quite a number of time working on how to talk about change over time. We've also spent some time looking at how to talk about how to compare and contrast. And tonight we were looking at main ideas, what information to include when we've got a lot of information in a graph. And tonight we've also looked briefly at how to write an introduction by rephrasing the language, using synonyms, and trying to use different parts of speech. Right. So, do you have any questions? Do you need me to scroll back so that you can take a screenshot of any particular slide? Were you able to hear me clearly tonight? Is the volume loud enough for you? Good. Well, that's all from us this evening. That's all from us Future Ed this evening. And if you are needing some help with your IELTS, particularly if you need that high score for writing, if you need that 7, it's not always something you can achieve on your own. But we do offer these online courses, and we're building lessons. We're building this course. We also have an evening class for writing task 2 on a Tuesday evening between 6 and 8. And we also have classes for the reading, listening and speaking on Saturday between 6 and 8, and on Sunday between 10 and 12. If you require a very high score and you've persevered with courses and you need individual attention with your writing, we do offer private tuition to help you get that 7.5 for your writing. The school also offers a mock test, and this is a good option. So if you haven't done the test for several years, or you have never done it before, I suggest you come along and do a mock test first, get an idea of your band score, and then you'll have an idea of how far you need to go, and you'll have an idea of what your weaker skills are. Most often that's your writing, and then followed by your reading. And these just take practice, getting to know the test and picking up some techniques along the way and practice. So I would suggest you do a mock test first. It's cheaper than certainly enlisting, booking for the full exam. And then once you feel you're ready, once you've done some preparation, then book your exam with us when you're ready. And if you do need some more information, you're welcome to contact our head office in New Zealand. That's here in Henderson. And there are a couple of numbers. You can also pop in, or you can contact us online through the website.